tell me of a place where my friends all have gone, and they tell me of that land far away. Oh, and they tell me of a place where no storm clouds fall. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. Oh, the land of the cloudless day. Oh, the land of an uncloudy sky. Oh, they tell me of a place where my friends have gone. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. Oh, they tell me that he smiles on his children's face, and his smile drives his sorrows away. And they tell me that no tears ever come again. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. Oh, the land of the cloudless day. Oh, the land of an uncloudy sky. Oh, they tell me of a place where my friends have gone. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. Well, they tell me of a home far beyond the sky, and they tell me of a home far away, and they tell me of a home where no storm clouds fly. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. Oh, the land of a cloudless day. Oh, the land of an uncloudy sky. And they tell me of a place where my friends have gone. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. Oh, the land of the cloudless day. Oh, the land of an uncloudy sky. They tell me of a place where my friends have gone. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. They tell me of a place where my friends have gone. Oh, they tell me of an uncloudy day. So last week I told you if you wanted to get to the dream part, you'd have to show up this week. And some of you weren't here last week, so the beginning part of the book of Daniel might properly be called The Legend of Daniel and His Friends. The stories of Daniel are placed across about a 60-year period of time, starting roughly about the time of the exile, so that'd be about 595 BC, but initially before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And in the course of the story, Daniel it models how to live in exile, which I think I think that's the metaphor for our lives as well. The nice thing about Daniel is the function of the stories, so you don't have to get bogged down in whether or not it's historically accurate or not. You just skip that. Focus on what the function of the story is. The function of the story is what is known in Jewish teaching as midrash. So midrash are these stories that teach us about God, teach us about life, teach us about the Torah, the law, the scriptures, and that's what's going on here. When the book of Daniel is written is about 166, roughly 166 BC. And it's written during the time of the king whose name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. But here's the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar, most people say Nebuchadnezzar, but you know, I gotta pronounce it fancy like. This is the king's dream. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. The statue was large, of extraordinary splendor. It was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet of a mixture of iron and clay. And you continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. When really bad stuff happens to us, what we do is we try to figure it out. You ever notice that? Like, we ask questions like, why did they do that to us? Or, well, how come I got cancer? We're always looking for an explanation. The problem is, anyone who's actually gotten an explanation realizes that the explanation doesn't help. Doesn't make you feel any better. You know, now that you understand exactly why it happened, how do you feel? As miserable as ever, to quote an old, actually Buddhist parable. So, but it is nonetheless the nature of human beings to do this. And so we're always looking for patterns that can explain what's going on, because chaos is the thing that frightens us. So we like to impose control, and we're not comfortable with chaos. And so defining and identifying patterns is just normal. In the ancient world, in particular in the ancient Mideast, so this is not characteristic of, say, the Greek world. This is characteristic of the what sometimes is referred to as the Oriental world, and by Oriental here they mean what we also call the Mideast, as opposed to Asia. So this would be Syria, what today would be Iran, Iraq. In the ancient world, it would be Judeo-Palestine, Babylon, Assyria, stuff like that. So there was a pattern that developed, a kind of belief that history could be described as having eons to it, ages, that were marked by kingdoms or empires. And there was a kind of normal way of thinking that there were 4 of these empires, and that was sort of world history, was these 4 empires and then whatever. So it's not surprisingly, in that world, the vision picks up on this theme, and sees this statue with different colors, each one representing a different empire. So the first empire, the Empire of Gold, is the Babylonian Empire. Probably originally, before it finds its way into the book of Daniel, this way of thinking, that is probably the Assyrian Empire. And then the silver one represents the Babylonian Empire. But in the interpretation that Daniel is giving to the king, the gold is the Babylonian Empire. And this is followed by the Empire of the Medes, followed by the Empire of the Persians, followed by the Empire of Alexander the Great. That's the iron.
And then you have the next one that where the iron is mixed with clay. That's actually still the Greek Empire. But what happened is Alexander's, I don't know if you know anything about Alexander the Great, but they call him the Great for a good reason. This guy conquered the world, more than the world that anybody knew. The empire of Alexander starts in Macedonia, which is way up by Greece. It included Greece, Macedonia, all around the Mediterranean as far as Egypt, and it went east through Iran and Iraq all the way into Afghanistan. Alexander the Great is the only person, the only empire to ever conquer Afghanistan. Isn't that amazing? In all of Afghanistan history, he's the only guy to do it. That's how big this empire was. And then he got it, you know, he kind of been finishing it up. Things were going really great. And then all of a sudden he dies. Boom. He's like 33 years old when this happens or something. 30, 33. He's a young man. He was a pretty good and pretty smart ruler, because one of the things he did was he understood that for an empire to survive, it has to have a sort of, there has to be a through line of culture within it. And so everywhere he went, he built a Greek city. So following the Greek pattern, what's called the Greek polis, he would build a city, and that city would have the Greek things in it, like a library and a gymnasium and all of these things that characterize Greek cities. And he made sure that everywhere, everybody in the empire knew Greek. That was bringing Greek language, because that meant that no matter what language people spoke, they could speak to each other still in Greek. Now that, by the way, can be interesting. English right now serves the same function, say, across Europe. Everybody, well, most people speak some English. It does get funny sometimes. I actually had a conversation this weekend with, like, it's me and 3 French guys. One of them is perfectly fluent in English because he lives in Arizona. He has a really thick accent, dear friend of mine, but he understands it on both sides of the conversation. Another one was okay with his English, but not great. Probably better than my French. And then the other guy knew hardly any English. And that was the guy who was doing most of the talking. And of all things, he was talking about, again, trying to figure out the patterns and understand the order of things. It just happened to be the Chinese zodiac, which goes through the 60-year cycle thing. And I'm trying to pick up this up, and there's Chinese words thrown in and French words thrown in. And I'm like, okay. Actually, when I looked up a couple words later, once I looked up a couple of Chinese words, I went, oh, that's what he was talking about. But at least in the ancient empire, people all spoke the same language. And I've actually witnessed this. I was standing in line once somewhere. I was somewhere in France. Standing in line to go in. I don't know why. I was visiting someone, and I'd got, sometimes when you have guests, you have to hand a guest over to someone because you have work to do. I get handed over to the chauffeur. Technically just the driver. I don't really mean chauffeur, like around the chauffeur. Just the guy who did the driving. So he took me he thought that I would be really interested in going to this place where they make aperitif, which is a kind of alcoholic beverage. Because, I was so interested in that. It was an interesting building. It was designed by the same and built by the same guy who did the Eiffel Tower. It was built by Eiffel. But we're standing in line, and these 2 guys start talking in English. And my friend, this guy, my guide, he laughs and he goes, they're from different countries, so they have to talk to each other in English. And I actually met a couple at another time where he was French and she was Chinese, and they met, fell in love, and got married in English because he didn't speak Chinese and she didn't speak French. So that's what happens when you have a language that just extends through an empire. So Greek spreads through the empire. The culture is all over the place. These cities dotting these Greek-style cities was a very good plan. And then he dies. And he had 4 generals under him, and you know what they did. So his empire is divided into 4 sections. And that's what's represented by the mixture of iron and clay. And for the time when the book of Daniel is being written, it's only 2 of the 4 kingdoms that they care about. There's a kingdom kind of that occupies Syria mostly, which is called the Seleucid kingdom. And then there's one that occupies Egypt, which is called the Ptolemies. And they constantly are sort of wrangling over Palestine. Because no one ever fights over Palestine. Turns out that's been going on for a really long time. So they're always fighting over Palestine. And Antiochus Epiphanes, this king, is the Seleucid king. And he goes after the Ptolemies and he loses. And he's very upset about this. And he decides to throw a tantrum in Jerusalem by trying to get all of the people who are in Jerusalem to become Greek in how they live their lives. And he does a number of things like desecrates the temple. He sets up an altar to Zeus right in the Holy of Holies where the altar to God is, and sacrifices to Zeus and forbids the sacrifice to Jehovah. And this is a huge crisis. And he tries to force people, sometimes in the most terrible ways, to do things like eat pork and violate the laws of eating kosher. And this is the world they're in. This is a terrible place to be in. And so here are these people looking at this governmental system that is attacking their way of being faithful to God. And they're struggling. And so the book of Daniel ultimately is a message to people in that time that they need to hang in there. Because you see, how does the vision end? You have these kingdoms, and then suddenly there's a stone which is not carved by hand. That's the holy people of God, the pious ones. By the way, the word in Hebrew is the Hasidim, from which even the modern word, the Hasidic Jew, comes from. The pious ones. This is carved by God, a people of God, and it smashes and destroys all of the empires of the earth. They shatter into dust, and that it is established as a huge mountain that fills the earth. And that's, of course, symbolically is always going to be the mountain of God. This is about how in the end of the story there is always the success of God and the reign of God's people, not because they're powerful, but because God carves them out. And so there's ever a message that says, keep the faith, hang in there, don't let go. But it turns out that this story, this vision of Daniel, has become a watchword. Have you ever heard the expression, feet of clay? This is where it comes from. Feet of clay is a reference to the fact that no matter how good someone is, there's always that sort of dark side. And that's where the trouble always shows up. It's true of governments as well. No matter how good a government is, no matter how strong it is, there's a weak spot, a place where it can be destroyed and dismantled easily. There's a saying that my son learned as a teacher that went like this. My son is a choir music teacher in high school. And it takes 7 years to build up a music program and 7 weeks to destroy it. You see, that's what the feet of clay does. It so quickly destroys these things. And actually, if you look at any human institution, any human thing, whatever it is, you will find that true, that it cannot survive, ultimately. It cannot survive. And so this is why I think it's a problem that we always are trying to survive, right? We love to impose our idea of how things should be on people so we make sure that they do it the way we think they should do it from now on. So what happens, you see this all the time, as culture changes, you see politicians and lawmakers trying to write laws that will stop the cultural change, the new ideas that are coming around, the new ways of thinking, so they write laws to prevent it. In churches, when churches are confronting, new theological concepts and beginning to deal with a whole new generation of people who just plain think different than the old fogies. Like, I think you said you were 30, right? You're 32. We're the old fogies. You see a different world than we do. You have a different set of values than we do because of the culture. And so that means that the church, your church, the church that is going to feed you, is not necessarily the church is going to feed me. I saw the look in your eye when we started singing all these old hymns, and there was a part of you going, I don't think I've ever heard that song before, at least once. Right? But you're probably used to a lot of that great contemporary Christian music, like you see here on 103. But when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, okay. That's an okay song. That's my reaction. So what happens is we begin to struggle over this. We got to have it this way. We got to establish it, and then once we've established it, we've got to fix it in place. But that's us trying to glue together the feet of clay so they won't shatter. And maybe we should think of it differently. What if we looked at all of our churches, regardless of denomination, and said, here's our best understanding of how to worship God and how to love God, how to serve in God's name the people around us. But that understanding is not fixed. It's going to change. It's going to shift. It's going to move. It's going to become something different. So can we make room for that in our churches, in our lives? Can we make space for people who are going to think differently and who will have a slightly different idea of what is the best way to worship God, to understand who God is, to serve in God's name the people around us? Can we do that? What was it? And listening when speaking of other faiths too. I mean, again, I'm just going to pick on you guys because you're all young. Your generation you have the internet. My generation is like, Islam is whatever it is. You guys can actually look it up and find out what it is. Wikipedia gives you a pretty good summary of what Islam is really all about, despite what you find on Facebook. All those Muslims believe this, and then you look at Facebook and you go, or on Wikipedia, and you're like, that doesn't look anything like what they say on Facebook. Why? Because the people on Facebook don't know anything about Islam. You guys get to find out on your phones, for crying out loud. Turns out there's some really cool ideas in other religions that are ideas that strengthen our understanding of who God is, how it is to serve in God's name the people around us. So I think for me, I always struggle with this idea that, because I'm super Orthodox and I have this, like, it should be like this. And I'm constantly trying not to hold on too tightly. Because no matter what, it's all going to disappear. It's all going to change. I used to believe that, I would come into a church and I would do my thing, and then after that, the church would enter its golden age. And what I discovered was I would go into a church and I would do my thing, and we'd have a good experience, and I'd leave. And then some other pastor would come in and do their thing, and the church would shift and change as a result, and it wasn't the same anymore. And sometimes people would get upset about that, and some people loved it. I would sometimes hear people talk about how great their new pastor is. I go, how's Pastor so-and-so? Awesome! And I'm thinking, no, you're supposed to think I'm awesome and no one was ever as good. But you're all just striving to hold on to what I left as a legacy. Nope, no legacy. Just disappears. In fact, when I read this story and I think about it, I can't help but think of a really old song, which everyone in the room probably knows, except maybe the youngest ones in the room, you guys. That goes, same old song, nothing lasts forever but the earth and sky. Right? All we do crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see. Dust in the wind. Everything is dust in the wind. Let's find the prayer response and pray together. It is hard to accept that no human endeavor can last. Regardless of how precious or how noble the effort, there will always be those feet of clay, and inevitably the whole thing will fall in on itself. Lord Jesus, is it idolatrous of me that I spend more time in the preservation of my work than I do in the birthing of new things? Is it arrogant of me that I seek to leave behind a church conformed to my opinions, rather than leaving behind a church rich with possibilities for a next generation to develop? Help me not seek some golden past, or try to establish an ironclad permanence. Instead, let me be working for a future carved by your love. In your name, I pray. Amen.
I serve a risen Savior. He's